Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give folks another minute or two here to get into the call before we get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Gerald and Nikita. Thank you for being here. We have about 80 people watching this, so whenever you're ready, Renika.
Perfect. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. People will still be trickling in a little bit here as we get going. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. This is our Decolonizing Curriculum Lunch and Learn, the second in our Decolonizing Education series, leading up to our Decolonizing Education Conference that will be hosted at the beginning of November, 3rd through 5th at the moment. So yeah. I want to give an opportunity for our two panelists today to introduce themselves. And so I will pass it on over to Gerald.
Thank you. My name is Jarrell Davis. Also go by Rel Be Free as a musician. I'm from the South End of Seattle. When it comes to introducing myself, I'm not really big on all the titles and stuff like that. But I'm a co-founder of Washington Building Leaders of Change, other known as WABLOC. I'm an organization that works with young people, specifically in Rainier Beach, Emerson Elementary School, South Shore, K-8, Aki Kurosi, Middle School, Rainier Beach area schools. I no longer work with WABLOC, but still affiliated. I'm currently in the Rainier Beach Action Coalition headquarters. And that is the community-based organization that I've been working with for a number of years as well. I'm an educator, a musician, a student of Nikita's, and so it's an honor to be on a panel with them. Can I pass it to Nikita?
Yes, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikita Oliver, as they, them pronouns. I am the executive director of Creative Justice, which is an arts-based healing engaged space for young people. We focus on creating spaces where through an art practice, young people can talk about, create about what healing and health looks like for them. And when they're ready, be able to use that artistic practice to speak truth to power. And I think, part of the reason we do that is arts and culture is very foundational to all of our lives. When we think about decolonized educational settings, telling our stories, how we tell our stories, how we pass down our stories is actually a really important part of that work. And so Creative Justice ties that into the way that we partner with young people. We started originally as a diversion program, which a lot of people, they don't think about diversion from the school to prison pipeline as an arts, as arts has a place in that. But we have found that arts and culture actually has probably one of the most significant places in creating opportunities to thrive that really keep all of us out of systems of harm and oppression. So excited to share space with you all today.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and get started in with our questions, and to our panelists, feel free to just hop in and on either one, no need for me to call upon you. So our first question that we have today is, what does a decolonized curriculum look like?
Okay, y'all want me to start?
Go
Yeah, I
ahead.
got you. Mhm. Well, I think before we get too deep into the weeds, it would be good to like have an understanding on like what decolonize means, and because you have a conversation with folks, and that is not always we're not always on the same page about what it means for something to be decolonized. So when I think of decolonization, I don't just think of uh, not Eurocentric, but it means that it also looks to undo the conditioning of education that we've experienced. And so um, it's countercultural to the mainstream, but it's also intercultural and includes multiple voices, perspectives, and as Nikita just referenced, as you know, art being a part of their decolonized education, decolonized curriculum also requires different mediums to be used when it comes to the education process and within curriculums. And so when we define colonization as the process of imperial powers dominating indigenous and Black people to be able to enforce a particular mindset, call it brainwashing, because we're all pretty brainwashed in America, like with reality, like with all reality. So to decolonize an education and to decolonize a curriculum means not only to come up against those things, but to also actively fight against those things. And so it's empowering to young Black kids. It's empowering to young non-binary and queer young people who have never seen themselves represented in the curriculum. It also means maybe not doing so many essays. That may be a part of it. It's adapting to the learning styles of the classroom. And we know that there's more than one learning style, but we could probably all point to any math teacher we've ever had, and we could say, okay, they fit into this particular box of style of teaching. And so there's a lot of ways that we could break down what decolonization is as a process, and then also the intersection of the decolonization process of curriculum obviously is what we're here to dive a little bit deeper into. So that's where I'll start with some of the things I just mentioned, and I'll pass it to Nikita, who I'm sure will add to this conversation as well.
Yeah. To think about what is decolonized education, I try to first think about what is colonization and the impacts of colonization. Um, when nations or places are colonized, the group that comes in and takes over and oppresses really strips Indigenous people of our history, of our stories, of our language, of our religion, of our understanding of the world around us, of the way our relationships function. You know, in the United States, the nuclear family, this idea that you have a mom, a dad, and a couple of kids, maybe a dog and a house and a fence. That's actually colonization. The idea that that is the only way a family structure works. And in the United States, we've actually built our laws around that colonized view of family. And in the educational context, I often see young people whose families are not structured like that struggle in school, and not because they're not good at school, not because they aren't smart, but because the structure of the school day, the school building, the way that homework is done, the things that they're studying in class often only further try to erode the way in which their family has maybe retained the different ways that families can look, and often see those families and those young people be in contention with the school or the school district or the educator in the classroom. And that is a function of colonization, is to say that there's only one language we learn in. There's only one way to talk about history, to write down the history of the victor, and to, in many ways, try to force us all to assimilate into one way of thinking about how things are or how things are done. When I was getting my master's of education, I had a professor who is Native, and I was taking a theory of knowledge class. And she talks about how majority of our educational experiences are actually informal. We tend to only think about education as the time we spend in school, but you spend way more time in your home or on the bus or hanging with your friends. And those are still educational spaces. And she would start every class telling a Native story. And then she would connect that story to something we know in Western science. So she tells a story about how the plants and humans made an agreement with each other that if the humans would take care of the plants and the trees, our plant relatives, then they would take care of us. Now, the story is much longer than that, it has way more detail, it's much more beautifully told. But she then reminds us what we know from Western science, that humans breathe out CO2, we breathe in oxygen, and plants breathe in CO2 and breathe out oxygen. And often Native elders have told me when I'm in a period of crisis or emotional or not feeling well in my body to go walk in the woods. And that comes from that story, that acknowledgement that when we care for our plant relatives, they will care for us. It also then aligns with things that Western science taught us much later than when that story came out or when that story was told. And that story also is multifaceted. It doesn't just teach us how our bodies work or how our plant relatives work. It also ingrains in us a value for the planet that we live on. So when we think about all of the work that our Native relatives are doing, our Indigenous relatives around the world are doing to protect the planet, it really also instructs us about our relationship to the planet that we live in and our relationship to each other, because taking care of our plant relatives also ultimately is taking care of our other human relatives and our other animal relatives. And so I tell that story because for me, decolonized education is really grounded and rooted in our culture and our stories. And it has a protective factor to it, that it doesn't, in the sense that that story teaches us about a myriad of healthy relationships. It also teaches us what we later learn in Western science. But in our schools here in the United States, we often do not have a value for the stories that our Native relatives have passed down and have been in existence since time immemorial. And bringing that into those spaces, having those stories exist. I see Sarah Sense Wilson is on this call, and I know that she creates those decolonized spaces for Native youth to be able to bring forward the knowledge that we've always known and have a value for it, a deep value for it. Colonized education spaces will actually tell you those stories are not important or that they don't have value. When in reality, what I learned in that, going back to that theory of knowledge class, is that when Native youth had access first to the stories that their relatives have passed down for forever, they actually were able to do better in all other educational contexts because it gave the much needed cultural and relational scaffolding to be able to take in other information in a way that they could make sense of it. A colonized educational space, because it strips us of our knowledge of self, actually makes learning much harder. And that's part of why we see Black, Indigenous, Brown young people all over the United States struggle in school because they lack access to the cultural scaffolding that first affirms who we are, so that when we take in other knowledge, we actually know what to do with it. So I'll stop there. Sorry, that was a lot. I really enjoy this conversation.
Oh no, thank you so much. So thinking of about race, how would you or how do we tackle race when we are thinking and working towards decolonizing curriculum?
I feel very strongly about this because the way that we view race in the United States is very, it's contextual, but we treat it as though it's global. Like our understanding of what race is extremely a social construct that now has lasting real life implications. But it's because it's been taught from a particular conditioning and perspective. So in a decolonized curriculum and decolonized space, when we're talking about race, it has to be globalized. We have to globalize the concept of race, because if you go to Brazil and you talk about race, it's a very different context. You know what I'm saying? What the breakdown of how people are stratified based on the color of their skin or based on their ancestry and ethnicity. And so when we are thinking about, in this United States context, a place that was originally war was placed upon among the indigenous folks, and then they went across the seas to bring in African folks and folks from Asia to be able to do this work on the ground. It's not just teaching those things, but it's also teaching, like, there is a value in that process. And I think that's one of the problems with the way that race is taught now, is that it seems to be devoid of intention. Like, they just want to talk about race as though it occurred. But we need to be having value conversations that these individuals made specific decisions at particular points of time, and this was the outcome. But if we only talk about things very transactionally, if you ever think about, history class, I don't know if folks have ever, there's a class called APUSH, AP US History. And it's the bane of all high school juniors' existence, because it's a class that's just, it's facts, it's time and places, and it's just purely content. But there's rarely any critical dialogue around the decisions and the volition that all these characters are making, that had to be able to make these decisions that created the context that we live in today. And so when it comes to addressing race in a decolonized curriculum and decolonized spaces, it's tough, because race is a thing that it's not genetically real, but it has extremely real implications in our lives. It has economic implications. It has, the outcomes of a Black third grader is influencing institutions like prisons, right? And so we know that there are real outcomes and real connections to these things. And so it's really talking about those impacts, talking about the intersection of race, the history of it, as, from eugenics, talking about this very purposeful process to teach people to think in a certain way, and then giving young people a creative space to think beyond it. And that's really what decolonized education, and education by definition, to educe, it means to extract, it means to take out. And so approaching a decolonized education would then be giving the opportunity, creating spaces where young people's own stories, their own histories, what they know to be true, is considered valuable in the education. And it's not, oh, get rid of those thoughts and let's put these thoughts in you. And so people are able to bring their own perspectives. Latinx folks who maybe have relatives that come from a different country are able to provide their experience and their ideas on what race looks like, as well as Black folks who maybe, like myself, don't know where our ancestors come from. So the conversation of race is actually a triggering conversation, because some folks know where their ancestors come from and they can have that conversation. And so it really has to do with creating the space that allows for young people's stories, as Nikita was referring to, not just to be told, but to be valued as a part of the greater narrative of the education. And I'm probably gonna wanna respond to whatever Nikita's about to say. So I'm gonna stop there and pass the mic.
I really agree with, I think we see this a lot in quote unquote progressive Seattle, where a lot of places have race and social justice initiatives, or they have a DEI coordinator, or they talk about inclusivity, or they talk about being anti-racist. Like, maybe that's a value they've stated, they want to be anti-racist. But when it comes down to actually having a deep understanding of where race came from and the impact that it's had, its historical context, and also its present day impacts, the fact that it's not real, but it also has real impacts, is not often is completely missed. And so as a result, all of our race and social justice initiatives, our DEI coordinators, our anti-racist values often fail. And we actually see Black, Indigenous, people of color all feeling often even more microaggressions, an expectation to come in and we do the work. Like, we're expected to undo white supremacy in workplaces and schools, in the system. And in reality, if we were really grounded in an understanding of where race as it exists developed, if we really understood the power dynamics that are created in a society that is built very much hierarchically around race, if we took seriously the impacts and implications, we would actually be seeing more young white people being taught how to actively dismantle white supremacy in the spaces that they live and they are. And that would be a value that would, the way that we view it would actually start to construct the pathways we take to dismantle it. And because we view it as race is a thing that everyone is responsible for in terms of racism, we actually take the burden, the responsibility, I should say, off of those that benefit from it, because we lack the power analysis. And I think a lot of that comes out of what Jarrell was saying. It's just a total lack of context and history around how race has evolved, and also doing it in a way that tries to generalize it across the board. Race in Brazil does not function the same way race in the United States does. Race in the United States literally evolved very tightly in its relationship to capitalism. So we have to have an economic conversation in the United States while we're simultaneously having a conversation about race. Because before Black folks were enslaved on Turtle Island, there were both Black and white indentured servants. And as indentured servants all started to become free, wealthy white folks realized a couple of things. One, we don't have nobody to do our work at low wages anymore. And they started to see formerly indentured white and Black folks marrying each other, which started to build a lot of people power. There was a lot of mobilization to actually start to overthrow the wealthy in that time period. And so the invention of race was for the purpose of stopping revolution. It was to divide and conquer. And then it also became about being able to create a very cheap supply of labor, which came at the exploitation and the enslavement of Black peoples. And if we don't have that real conversation and then see the ways in which what I call racialized capitalism has evolved into a continuation of enslavement and racial oppression and racial hierarchy, though it is much more complex now in the United States because we have a lot of Black, Indigenous, and Brown communities that exist here now. The reality is that root is still there. And just to take it back to the earlier question about what is decolonized education strives to tell the whole truth. Colonized education tries to tell a part truth. So you will buy into the system of racialized capitalism, you won't question it, and you won't try to dismantle it. But if we really understood the full roots, the whole truth of how we got to where we are today, many more people would be mobilized and also have the knowledge base to actively start dismantling it. We would go back to the space of having much more people power because we would be radicalized around the truth. And so when I think about colonialism and how colonialism uses education, it is often for the purpose of stripping us from a truth, or stripping a truth from us that would keep us radicalized. And I think about radical and the way that Angela Davis said it, getting to the root. So keeping us root connected. Colonization doesn't want us to be root connected, because when you're root connected, you will be much more likely to push back against oppressive and authoritative systems. And so the more we can tell the whole truth in its entirety and become much more root connected, we will actually become much more people and relationship connected. We will have much more people power. And this current fear around talking honestly about race in schools is, I don't think that's a fear of those of us that are impacted by racism and white supremacy. That is a fear of those who benefit from racism and white supremacy, because they know once we all know the truth, we're gonna have to respond to it in a way that actually gets us to a place of honesty and how we live together.
Yeah, Nikita, that part. Facts. I hate when somebody says like, "Oh, you know, this is hard to talk about when we're talking about race." Look it, bro. I'm Black. I got to talk about race my whole life. Since I was in school, when I was 5 years old, we've had to talk about race. So if it's hard for people to talk about race, then it's going to be really hard to educate the concept of race in a decolonized manner. And so I really just want to reiterate what Nikita said about decolonized education has to be radical. It can't not be radical. And what radical means is to get at the root. But we know that the platform of education that we've all been raised in, that we are living in, has more to do with surface level education than it does root level. And going back to the original intention of what education facilities, because we can't take for granted what school is. I think that we don't think about the history of education, which we should on a globalized scale. The first educational facilities in Kemet and in modern day Egypt, they were educational facilities. And the term education had to do with extracting the brilliance out of not just young people, but adults still engaging in an educational process. And that education, the ultimate intention of education is to lead people on a process of self-actualization, which will improve their ability to engage with the people around them and create societies that everyone is valued in. We can agree that that is absolutely not the intention of the United States education. We know that's not the truth. As Nikita just mentioned, it's economic, it's labor. And so when it comes to talking about race in a decolonized classroom, it's understanding that race connects to economics, race connects to health, race is a political, race makes education a political issue, because whoever is receiving quality education is probably in a different political position, as well as the social impacts. And as Nikita mentioned, you know, the government's oversight of education influences what is taught in the classroom. And so when it comes to race, I think something we also have to mention is who the hell is teaching it? Because who the teachers are and who these educators are, you could have a filthy curriculum. It could be a beautifully laid out, Nikita Oliver got their tag on it. You might have a wall block lesson in there. You might have a creative justice young person who has a great activity in there. If you got some bozo, some geek off the street that is really not wrestling with their whiteness, and they're not pushing themselves to really understand the power dynamics of how they're showing up in the classroom, throw it in the trash. It's not going to have a healthy impact. In fact, they're going to embrace the savior complex. And so as we continue these conversations, I'm sure we're going to talk about how educators are educated. And Nikita's been through a master's in education program. And I've worked with educators for the last decade at multiple levels. And we can say for sure, they are not being prepared to teach Indigenous Black children. That's not what UW is working on. It's not what SU is doing. I don't know about other schools outside the state, but I'm sure they're not really preparing these teachers to be able to teach decolonized classrooms. And so by recognizing those power dynamics and the intersection that race plays and all these other systems that affect us, the educators themselves have to absolutely be on their own process of self-actualization and engage in that education as well in order to create spaces that are safe for our young people to wrestle with those things. And that's why, I'll say for myself, I know I'm on that route, I'm on that road still as well. So there is some humility when it comes to holding these educational spaces for our young people. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So how does ethnic studies play a role in decolonizing the curriculum, and how, kind of going off of what you just said, how can we be preparing our teachers um, to have these open and safe spaces and teach ethnic studies in a way that, I don't want to say proper, but just in a way that does more good than harm, that doesn't continue to harm our students and our families?
Yeah, I'll hop in first. To be honest, I actually really struggle with the way we frame ethnic studies. I feel like, we're having to fight for it to exist in the schools, but it still gets framed as the other. um, with the way it gets framed as an add-on, or an additional class, or a learning opportunity. And then the mainstream curriculum still remains the same, but with the add-on. And so I have actually really been struggling with, how do we actually fight for decolonized education, as opposed to the reform. Like, I always think of things in transformation and reform, right? Getting ethnic studies as a class is a win, or as a credit is a win, but it doesn't transform the system that is constantly trying to bring us into a colonized worldview. And I went to a college of education, and I can tell you, only thing I learned to do was to teach a colonized worldview. I argued with my professors nonstop. I am pretty sure when I graduated, they threw a party and were happy they would never have to teach me again, because I would often argue with even just the material they selected to have future educators think about how they build curriculum, because even the materials we were given kind of made us like the overseers. Like we were overseeing the continued colonization, because the materials that, and the way that I was taught to be an educator, are the materials and the things that the colonized education system wants us to keep teaching. So, understanding the history of where schooling in the United States came from, the general school system was created to create, to assimilate folks to a nation state and a particular way of viewing history and our story. It wasn't necessarily about getting folks the tools that they need to be creative thinkers and have ingenuity and continue to help us grow. And we've only actually continued to perpetuate that model in our school system. So as much as I think standards in education are important, the 21st century learning requirements, some of them are really just us bringing forward more colonized ways of educating. And so to bring it back to ethnic studies, I actually would love it if, as an education community, we would start pushing for a whole reworking of the curriculum. Like, if we could stop teaching the brand of US history that we teach, it would be great. Because I think that class is traumatizing. If you are a young person whose history, whose culture tells you anything different than what you learn in those textbooks, you are constantly engaging with a traumatic experience. It is the continued recolonization of our peoples through our minds. And truly having ethnic studies, truly having a space where the goal of getting ethnic studies, sorry, I'm super scattered, but the goal of getting ethnic studies is to, should be to decolonize, not to put a check mark box. And we often treat it as a checkbox. Okay, great. All of our students took an ethnic studies class. They are now ready to know that Black Lives Matter and racism is a problem and we need to dismantle white supremacy, which is not true. Actually, what we've taught them is, as long as you have a few Black people, a few Native people, a few Cambodian people on your team, you're diverse. We're teaching our young people to check box on numbers, to have a quota, and not to actually learn the true story. And so I would love it if we could actually push ourselves to a place of asking, what would it look like if our history in schools, and I say our as a Black person descendant of formerly enslaved Black people, what would it look like if our history in schools was not limited to a single class or a credit, but was actually a part of all of the curriculum that we experience. And I think that that is so important to create that space of imagining a educational opportunity where we are not an add-on. We are actually like fully in the curriculum. We understand who actually created math. We understand where the first libraries really were. We know who some of the first like well-known educators were actually, you know, in Africa, and understand where the birth of some of the tools we use now came from. And that wasn't an add-on class that I got to elect to take, or that maybe I was forced to take, but it still didn't reflect our full history. I think there actually has to be a better way than just getting the check mark. Now, do I think that the getting ethnic studies in schools is a win? Yes, it's a win, but like we can't stop there. We have to really keep pushing for like a full change, a full shift in the curriculum, because that is what decolonized education would actually be.
I like hearing Nikita talk. They talk great. For real, I'm gonna keep it 100. It's a hot take, but I personally feel like public school should have got canceled last year, and an entire pause on all public education across the nation until what Nikita just said happened. Because what we're seeing occur, not just in education, but in probably the institutions and places that you work in, is a return to the status quo with a little shift in language. So we've seen these institutions add, oh, because of the death of George Floyd, the death, right, of George Floyd, now we're changing our slogan to be, you know, some bullshit. The reality is we probably should have canceled school altogether last year because we had the opportunity to rework the entire thing from scratch. But it's this commitment to gradualism that makes ethnic studies questionable and suspicious, not because of the heart and what it could teach, but the implementation of ethnic studies absolutely has to be suspicious because there's never really been an innovation in that institution of education. It's well documented that you could say that public education is one of the least innovative institutions in the United States. And so thinking about ethnic studies, Nikita said a lot of things that are absolutely true. And the only thing I would add is that, you know, man, it's a really hard topic. I can only speak for myself, but I know it's a tough decision to make because who are we entrusting to teach these ethnic studies classes? Who's creating the curriculum? And then how do we not perpetuate this tokenism that happens to Black and Indigenous and people of color in schools, the tokenism that occurs. So I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, and I had the opportunity to go to a variety of schools. I got to go to a high school that was a private school, O'Day High School. I am not Catholic, I am not white, but I was up in that all boys Catholic school getting traumatized. But shout out to people like Nikita and my family members who helped me overcome that. When you're in your social studies class and you're outspoken about issues and things that are related to your culture, they have some spaces they'd invite you to. Oh, Jarrell, you seem to be very vocal about this Malcolm X book. You should join the BSU. Okay, so I joined the BSU. That's eerily similar to the tokenization that occurs in these institutions. You think about how many Black folk or how many, fill in the blank are then hired as the representative of their entire people. So you may have a Vietnamese person that's hired to be the representation of all Asians, knowing that there's, what I'm saying, diversity amongst even their own cultures. But we then take on these opportunities to be tokenized. And so I feel like one of the problems with the idea of ethnic studies is that how does it get us away from being tokenized? And I have yet to see or hear any conversation or dialogue as to how that occurs. And that's really important dynamic to name. And as Nikita said, it's got to be a whole curriculum. If ethnic studies was the whole curriculum, it would include the gamut of arithmetic, mathematics and arithmetic. It would include art. It would include physical education and fitness. It would include health, because our cultures include all of these things within our livelihood. And so it would still be a full education, but it's being treated as though it's a class, as though it's a check mark. And so there's a lot of things when it comes to developing the curriculum, when it comes to identifying who's going to be teaching, and then, ensuring that it's not going to be traumatizing for young people. If you think about, if you're at a school where you're the minority and you're having to take an ethnic studies class with a classroom full of people that don't share the same or even a similar understand your background or where you're coming from, then that ethnic studies class puts you in the hot seat. And I tell you what, these teachers are okay with asking kids, so what do Black people think about this? I'm speaking from experience. I feel like I've heard Nikita tell stories about that, even in their college classes, even in their master's program, professors tokenizing people because of their identity. And what we need to really ensure is that ethnic studies doesn't just become a class to where tokenization is just encouraged and emphasized to a point that we start to believe this is the route, the talented 10th. W.E.B. Du Bois coined a term in the 1920s during the Harlem Renaissance called the talented 10th. And it basically meant only 10% of a particular group is going to be able to be accepted by society. If we look at this right now, the majority of our communities, Indigenous, Black, Southeast Asian, Latinx, immigrant, the majority of our communities are not doing well. But the small percentage of folks that are seem to be able to hold the representation of all of us. And it's just false. And so the hope would be that ethnic studies would be able to create a space where these conversations are able to happen in a safe and healthy way for young people to wrestle with them, not to be taught what they're supposed to think, but for them to be able to bring their own ideas and their histories and their stories to interact with the content. And that's what I'm curious of seeing how these ethnic studies in Seattle Public Schools manifest. Very curious to see how that goes. Mm-hmm.
So, continuing on ethnic studies, how do we make sure that ethnic studies aren't taught in a colonized way? And how do we implement things such as storytelling, community voice, shared experiences, music, dance, in teaching ethnic studies, and not, like you had said, it becoming more of a tokenized learning space, but a real authentic space for our students to wrestle with these different ideas and these different subjects in history that we're not usually confronted with in regular like public education.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to go back to kind of my earlier premise for that question is we're inherently doing it in a colonized way when we make it a separate class. We also do things like put everyone together. Like there's white history and then there's ethnic studies. And that just doesn't feel right to me. And actually, I feel like in some ways it reifies the idea that ethnic studies is the other. And I really do think that this is where we need a whole reworking of our curriculums and our education system if we're really going to get to a place where we are decolonizing education, where we are able to tell the whole truth and have whole conversations. I think that that I know that sounds like a huge undertaking, but if we want to get to a place where our educational system actually reflects the wealth of knowledge that we have within humanity and does it in a way that's not stratified or doesn't pick whose stories or history or culture matters, we would rework the way that we do education. And I think that that has to be a priority, especially given the ways in which we're seeing people push back even just against ethnic studies. Really, to me, shows us how endemic the problem of white supremacy is. And if we're really going to get to a place of dismantling it, we will need to rework and rethink how we do education. The way that one way I see, because I think there's a lot of ways to bring storytelling into our educational spaces, is really just opening up the space for that. With creative justice, we don't have to do a lot of prodding of our young people for them to share who they are. In fact, because the space has been co-created with young folks, and it has been created in a way that they also have the authority to change the space when it does not allow them to be their whole selves, they very naturally roll into sharing their full identities and bringing their stories with them, because they have some amount of, they have agency in this space. That's really what, like when I think about liberation, liberation for me is like very much rooted in a personal agency, a choice of how you interact with something. In our current school system, you don't have a choice of how you interact with your US history class. You just need to learn the facts, right or wrong, regurgitate them onto a test, and then move forward. But if you refuse to regurgitate those facts, including the ones that are wrong, you won't move forward. We actually incentivize lying in the US education system. So how do we actually incentivize young people's brilliance and their agency to question the material that they're given and actually celebrate when they do that truth searching work, that critical thinking work? And how do we create spaces for more of that? And I think the celebration part is really important. It's celebrating that you are asking the deeper questions and you want to have more knowledge, is a really important way of creating spaces where young people will bring their full selves. They will not bring their full self if they are being told that you get more or you win more or you move forward by just checking the box. So if I was an educator in a school where there was a particular, I'm going to just stick with US history, there was a particular US history book I was supposed to teach, how do I create space for my students to get to question the material? Like, just because this is the book the school gave us doesn't mean it's factual or right. So what am I adding into the space? What am I allowing in the space? What am I creating space for, where the student can also be the educator, is a really important thing. And I actually see Jarrell do this quite a bit at Rainier Beach when he was at Rainier Beach High School, where he would co-teach with educators and he would be the person bringing in the bigger picture or the other facts, or creating space for that critical thinking and that hard question asking. One of the things that I see educators often do is when a student questions the material they're bringing, they get offended and they want to have authority in the classroom, rather than celebrating the fact that your student is so engaged in your class and so engaged in knowledge sharing and wanting to know more, that they are thinking so deeply that they're now questioning this material. I think that that's actually a beautiful thing. And so how do we create more space for that? We'll naturally create more space for the storytelling. And then the third thing I will just say is, like, what art and culture space is happening in your educational spaces, and not like the kind of the tokenizing way where we bring in like a piece of someone's culture, we invite some dancers to come or something, but where are young people getting to, or I work with young people, so I say young people, but where are students getting to bring in their own cultural perspectives, bring in their own art and creativity? Where does that exist in the classroom? Because I think that actually naturally creates a liberatory space. The beauty of art for me is it is a space of experimentation. And if our schools and our education systems were really decolonized, educational places would actually be a space of experimentation to get things wrong, without without punitive responses, to think through where maybe something didn't go the way you thought it would, but it still turned out beautiful. And you're like, I want to understand that process. I want to preserve that. I want to try something new. I want to knowledge share. That's the beauty of an art space. When you get multiple artists together in a room, they all knowledge share with each other. No one's the expert, or maybe we're all experts in something and then we teach someone else. So I guess that would actually be a fourth thing I would say is like, where are you creating space for knowledge sharing? Where are the students getting to be the experts? Where are they being the educator? And how does that actually feed into an evolving educational space that has self-determination and personal agency?
Thank you so much, Nikita. I wanted to hop to a question in the chat from Catherine is, can you please speak to what harm reduction in current educational spaces looks like while decolonization is hopefully happening at the same time?
Yeah, I was actually finna get at that a little bit, adding on to what Nikita was saying. Thank you for the question. One of the things that's very apparent in public education right now is the lack of emotional intelligence that is emphasized in the classroom. Um, Teachers are not prepared to increase our young people's emotional intelligence. And so the question of harm reduction is important, but it also really depends on what angle you're coming from. Um, Schools are not generally safe places for a lot of our young people. They don't want to go there. They walk through the building and their security guards are looking for them. There may be other students. If a student walks into a classroom and a teacher has some smart remark, oh, good to see you today. Oh, you decided to show up today. That automatically makes it an unsafe place for them. And I've seen this from kindergarten to college students that have this kind of relationship with their building. And so it's hard to do harm reduction in a place you're not safe in the first place. You see what I'm saying? And so it takes more than just educators. It has to do with the educational space. I see in the question it says educational spaces. That has a lot to do with the facility, because there's going to need to be more resources available for those spaces, for those things. We got young folks who's coming into class. Maybe they didn't eat lunch. Maybe they didn't eat breakfast. Maybe they had a loved one that passed away the day before, and they're expected to come into the school and be on point and to pay attention and to engage. But there's not going to be any resources to check on them to be even able to engage fully. And so I think one of the ways that that education can be decolonized as well is by having emotional intelligence as a function of every class. Math teachers should be concerned for the emotional intelligence of the young people in their trigonometry class. It shouldn't just be a language arts or a health class that those conversations are happening. It should be across the board. And because those things have been so often kind of pushed to the side, almost incidental, it's the outcomes we're getting. I was just having a conversation with some young people about how health classes have been treated, specifically at Rainier Beach. They'll have a substitute teacher at Rainier Beach for the health class for 5 years. Substitute teacher that's not certified in health. And so kids aren't getting sexual reproductive education. They're not getting emotional intelligence education. They're not learning about their bodies, their biology. As they're transitioning from childhood to adulthood, they're not learning about the real things that happen to their bodies as they're transitioning that puberty, you know? And so I'm saying all this because when we talk about education, it should be serving the whole child. And so the question of what harm reduction looks like has a lot to do with the educational space's ability to serve the whole child. But when we're filling in a school with 800 students and 600 of them students got IEPs, individual education programs, but there's only 5 caseworkers in the building, then harm reduction's almost laughable, because how can it happen when harm is being recreated every period? And so adding to the last question as well, I think also just like valuing global scholars. There's a lot of students that are coming from different countries that are hitting the ground running, expected to hit the ground running, and they're learning English while they're in English class. They're reading books in English while they're learning English. This is wild. How do we expect that? Why do we do that to people? And a lot of them find a way to thrive as well, but really valuing our global students, because, you know, I think about a student that grew up speaking Spanish. Why the hell they got to take the Spanish fluency test? They speak better Spanish than the Spanish teacher. I've seen this a million times, right? And they have to do this, and this affects their graduation. How many students are having to take a Spanish class? They speak Spanish at home, and they got to learn Spanish in school, and they're going to fail if they don't. They won't get credit if they don't. That kind of wildness is like obviously like an assimilation tactic. You know what I'm saying? And Nikita was starting to get at this. Diversifying the sources of information is really important. So it's not just the books that are being used, but it's also that it's who you bring into the classroom. I think some of the classes that I remember being a part of, both as a student and as someone working with teachers on their curriculum, when there were featured guests, it was more impactful. It was the young people being able to see the educator say, I'm not the expert. Here's somebody that knows more than me. Let's learn together. When educators are able to do that, then young people lean in a different way. And just seconding the point of co-creation, whenever you're involved in the construction of something, you feel closer tied to the outcome, to whatever that is, whatever your contribution is. And so for young folks to be able to have the opportunity to speak into what should be taught, how it should be taught, giving them spaces to be the expert on some days, but not in a way that makes it their responsibility to teach, because that's where the boundary is. Sometimes, you know, it's like, oh, we're talking about Cambodian. Oh, you're Khmer. Teach us about Khmer history on Wednesday. That can be a little traumatizing too. You know what I'm saying? Like, so educators have to find the fine balance of creating spaces where we're elevating young people's stories, but we're not putting the onus of education on them. And I think one of the ways that can get at that, as well as the emotional intelligence, as well as creating safe spaces for them to engage, has to do, I'm a circle practitioner, and I truly believe that circle is one of the ways that we can engage in dialogical education. And I really think that a lot of education needs to be more needs to be more oral, needs to be more dialogical. We got young folks that can explain verbally things that they may not be able to explain by writing it. But if they can't write a 3-page essay, then they're getting failed, even though they can probably explain it better than a student that could type it. You see what I'm saying? And so it's creating the balance for the brilliance of these young people. And then just finally, yeah, that the artistic piece, and the arts not being tokenized as, you know, like, oh, okay, this is going to be the fun part. Art can be some of the most challenging things you can possibly do if you're really leaning into it. I'm a musician, I'm an artist, and people think that because I try to center my life around art, that means that like my days are easy. But my art comes from my heart, and it comes from the work that I'm doing internally. It comes from what I'm experiencing in my life. So actually engaging in art is some of the most challenging self-work you could ever participate in. And in fact, I think of some of the spaces I've been in with young people from creative justice. Those artistic spaces, even if the art was easy to make, the conversation was dynamic. The build up to creating the art was dynamic, is dynamic. And so, you know, not just painting, not just drawing, not just poetry. I heard you mention dance as well, but really incorporating some of the cultural ways that we hold intelligence through our art. And I think that that should be valued as well in decolonized educational spaces.
One thing I think is really good that Jarrell just said is not putting the failure of the education system on the young person. Like when he says onus, what I hear is failure. Like our educational system has failed to educate every young person in the way they deserve. And even in my opinion, even if 100% of every young person that touched our schools graduated, I still don't think every young person, based on our current way of educating, was educated in the way they deserve. And by that I mean it uh, many of them are being assimilated into a way of thinking and being that is not natural to who they are. And I think a lot about this hierarchy of writing versus ability to verbally express ideas. As a society, we've decided it's more valuable to be able to do things in writing. And that is because we are a society based in legal constructs and laws that are written and are so committed to things like contracts, like written contracts. That's why we do everything in writing. It's not really about your it's not as much about learning. It's more about assimilating young people into this contract world that says you do everything in writing. That's how we hold people accountable. I don't think that that's the only means of creating accountability. As a restorative justice, transformative justice practitioner, I think transforming the way we think about a lot of things will actually transform our educational system, because how we educate young people is actually the way that we're saying we want them to live in the world later. And by devaluing those who have oral and verbal skills, we're literally stripping many young people of their cultural history, where oral storytelling was the means of passing down our history, our truths, but also our rules and our guidelines about how we treat each other and what accountability looks like. And so when we limit it just to the written word, in many ways, we're telling young people accountability only looks like this current legal system. And we're devaluing the fact that many other cultures have had means of creating communal accountability. And that was created through the way that we told stories about how we treat each other, about how we treat the planet, about how we move with each other, about what we do when we need accountability. Circle practice is a verbal accountability process. You sit in circle, it gets rid of hierarchy, everyone moves through the process. We ask questions that help us deal with the social, emotional, and then we use the process to build out what are we going to do, not what are we going to write, what are we going to do to repair harm. And so we're actually stripping ourselves when we only value written ways of doing things from, we're preventing access to a whole nother skill set we have of passing down our histories, but also having healthy relationships and knowing different means of accountability and repairing harm.
A question from the chat from Nestor's. How do we convince educators in the STEM field that ethnic studies and decolonial studies is something that is essential to their curriculum and that it can actually advance and progress rather than hinder it, and that math, science, tech, etc. are racist spaces and they are not neutral or unbiased?
It's a really good question. Um, it kind of depends on what their hangup is, though. I guess I can't really speak for STEM educators and say I know what their general disagreement with ethnic studies is. Personally, I don't know if I could say that. So it probably depends on the educator and why they are averse to it. So I'd be curious. Yeah, I'm curious to hear the kids' response. But yeah, I'm not sure if I can. I don't know if I should project what STEM educators' reasons for not fucking with ethnic studies is. But I can say this: it's not everybody's job to convince them. And it's not one of my jobs, I tell you that much. I'd rather work with the young people than with the STEM educators around this piece. But I'm curious what Nikita would say, because I think it really depends on what their hang up is and the reason why. And that may be getting at something way deeper. That may be if someone is against ethnic studies because they think that it hinders STEM dynamics, then that may be a spiritual thing with that person. And I don't know if we're in the business of that kind of spiritual transformation. And I know it sounds kind of funny, but I'm also being serious. Toni Morrison said that that white supremacy should be treated as a mental illness. It should be treated as a neurosis. That racism should be treated as a neurosis. We should not just think about it like, oh, you're racist, your heart is weird, but no, that it's like a literal neurological issue that causes people to make these kind of connections. So I can't fathom how people can make a connection that STEM and ethnic studies don't go together. So I'd be curious to hear some of the things, Nestor, that you've heard STEM educators say, and I'm sure that'll probably be a really good dialogue to hear some of those things and to press up against those. What do you think, KL?
Yeah, is STEM, when we say that math, science, tech, et cetera, are racist spaces and they're not neutral or unbiased, I think there's no spaces that aren't neutral or unbiased, and if we create in the world that we live in now, still presently, we really have to understand that probably 99.9% of spaces, excluding the ones that we create for ourselves, are probably racist spaces. Math, science, and tech sees it, in a particular way because we have decided as a society that only certain people do math, only certain people do science, only certain people do tech, and have really devalued or created a lot of barriers of entry into these fields. I'm sure you all have noticed that the sky has been full of smoke and that it's been very hot. And reality is areas like math, science, and tech are going to actually be key to us developing a much greener society. And those who have been actually pushing us in that direction, though, are the folks that have the most barriers and challenges of getting into these fields. So thinking about all of our water protectors who have been telling us to get off fossil fuels, to stop pulling oil out of the ground, they're leading us towards being more green. And in many ways, math, science, and tech are going to play an important role in that. But the problem is right now, math, science, and tech are often actually driving us in the wrong direction. And it is because those who are protecting us and protecting our water and protecting our planet are also those who have the most significant barriers or challenges entering into spaces that are going to help us move into a green world, a green economy. I bring that up because I think really what we need to be doing is like, how do we break down more of the barriers of entry? How do we stop talking about math, science, tech spaces as being racist, as a cultural problem, and consider it's also like the way that we've been trained to use math, science, and tech, who we've said can do math, science, and tech, because those spaces are also sexist. There are not a lot of women or non-binary folks in math, science, and tech. We've really said that we've really said it is a white male space. Look at who has made the most off of tech in the last few years. in the United States, and then look at the way they've used that tech, like flying spaceships into the sky, where we actually spit out more carbon emissions and do worse to the planet. And then look at who's doing the work around environmental justice in a way that actually is about protecting the planet and our frontline communities. I see these things needing to tear down these barriers because we're going to have to make significant strides in that direction. In terms of convincing people, I'm full out of convincing people and more on protesting people at this point. Like, if you don't want to make the change, we might actually have to remove you from your seat or get you out of your job or build our own spaces. Because the more time we spend convincing people, the less time we have to actually address the things that are like major crises right now. I know that's not a full answer to the question, because I also share Jarrell's, like, I want to know who it is that's saying this, and I want to know what their hangup is, because I also think that can often be contextual in space. Yeah.
KO, you just said something that I really actually want to get at too. Around, you said convincing versus protesting. Educators need to be more agitating. I tell you what, one of the most annoying things is working at a school with educators who claim they care about the young people, but they will not challenge their colleagues. And if they do want to challenge their colleagues, they do so in private, or they do so in an email. No. We need educators that are really willing to put themselves on the line and be agitating. Education's in a dismal place. It's some people believe there's no going back of how bad it is. And I think when we treat it as though it's this urgent, then it makes you as a coworker, as a colleague, as somebody that is standing next to in a classroom next to somebody who you question their methods and their impact on the young people. Backbone. We need educators that are going to challenge other educators in their platform. And one of the most frustrating places to be a part of is a place where you feel like you're the one all the time that's pushing something. I think about the Black women that were working at Rainier Beach at the time that I was working there. They were always the main ones talking about sexism. They were always the main ones talking about the impact that security was having on Black girls. We need men to be supporting those folks and lifting those up. It can't just be leaving people to their own devices. And so we need people to be more agitating. And there's something about, once you're working if the principal is your boss, the principal has the power to fire you. There's the hierarchy. That's what we're talking about. That's called repression. The hierarchies are put in place to repress the radicalism. And so, similar to what Nikita said earlier about the invention of race being created to repress radical thought within society, the hierarchy within schools is created to repress revolution amongst the educators and, of course, the children as well. But we really if you're in a space where you have comrades, or you have colleagues who you question their impact on the young people, and that's not debatable. You can tell when a teacher is having a terrible effect on young folks. There was teachers at Beach that had a D average in the students, and they had 150 students, and the majority of their students got D's. That is the teacher's fault on every planet, on every day of the week. That is the teacher's fault. But if no other teachers are challenging them, who's going to get blamed? The children. And so just to that point around, convincing, protesting, and it's part of the reason why I don't I don't work for Seattle Public Schools, is we need to challenge them. We need to challenge educators. We need to be agitating in these spaces so that people know, and that the young people know you're going to fight for them. That's the problem, is that young people don't believe that teachers are going to fight for them. And the teachers that do put their neck out for them, those are the ones that have the lasting impact. that are remembered throughout their time, and they go back to those folks as people that empowered them and that supported them. And so centering the young people sometimes means challenging colleagues in their racism and their sexism, and even just bad practice. You know, like teachers, beyond being racist and sexist, sometimes they just be bad teachers. They're just low quality educators. And then there's no room for that because it comes at the expense of Black and brown children over generations. And we're tired of that shit.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. Um, Kind of switching over just a little bit, I'm gonna combine these two a bit. Is so preferencing that, knowing that there are multiple sectors to education, meaning there are more than likely multiple first steps to be taken in the process of decolonizing the curriculum. But what would y'all say are the first steps in decolonizing our curriculum? And adding on to that, what are some policies that you would like to see brought forward in upcoming sessions and passed in regards to changing the curriculum towards a more decolonized learning space?
That was a big question. Um, and yeah, you know, I really think one is how we interact with young people and their families. To go back to what I said earlier about the colonized worldview will tell you that only nuclear families are what exist. Um, we see a huge barrier to entry with schools for a lot of young people here in the South End because their family structures require them to take siblings to school or require them to do XYZ in another space, which changes the way that they interact with their education. I think one way, and I don't know how to translate this into policy fully, but one way that we can continue to create decolonized spaces in the education space is not expecting every family and student to be able to show up at the school building in the same way. How can we have multiple spaces of entry into educational environments that reflect the multiplicity of needs and also structures that our students and their families have? And that means that we stop standardizing everything. We stop treating schools like they're a factory model. That's what the general schooling effort was to create a factory model of education. You do first grade now, second grade now, third grade now, fourth grade now, and you go through, you check off all the boxes on all those things as if every young person's brain works the same or develops the same, as if every family structure is set up the same, as if we all have access to the same resources and supplies. We keep trying to push people through a factory model of schooling, and that does not work for every young person in every family. And one way that I see this happen, and it actually hurts families, is our truancy policies. When young people and families get sent to the truancy board, or they end up in court, or the state now has changed that a little bit, and there's like civil fines that families receive. And those are a really punitive and criminalizing way to address attendance that oftentimes is happening because there's another need or another setup in the family. And how are we really thinking about the way in which that actually harms the likelihood that a young person will get their education rather than helps? What is the restorative way of, and what is the supportive way of building educational environments that every young person and family can access? And then the second thing I would just emphasize is going back to our conversation around ethnic studies and being activist educators. Some of my favorite educators that I get to partner with are activist educators. They are from the inside, kind of setting off little bombs in different places to be tearing down a system of education that doesn't serve all young people, and to be at least within their classrooms building decolonized spaces. where we start small, we can also often expand big. So don't be afraid to take, well, you can be afraid, but be brave, and take risk in your own classroom or in your own school to create those spaces, and then to push rather than just having ethnic studies be an add-on. How are we actually just reshaping the way that we do school, reshaping the way we do curriculums? How are we evolving with the needs of our students? And I want to acknowledge that we're in a polarized time. We are in a time where there is a group of folks that are trying to maintain their power by keeping us in a system that tells lies and wants to train young people in lies, so that they will continue to perpetuate a system in some instances that actually harms them. And to be honest, this system harms everyone, whether you're the beneficiary of the privilege or you are the one harmed by the oppression. In the long run, we're all worse off. So how are we thinking about a much larger systems change? And Candace, thanks for dropping the Hawaiian immersion schools into the chat. I love learning about the ways in which folks are also preserving their culture and building their own schools and creating spaces where young people can be deeply rooted in culture. Those models do exist. They are happening. We need to value them more and uplift them and figure out how does that transform this factory model of education into something that is actually more holistic and more deeply rooted. I know that's not like a policy recommendation, but I'm gonna be honest with y'all. It is August 4th, and I'm a little tired and out of policy recommendations, if you know anything about the rest of my life, but really honored to share space with y'all.
Lovely. Yeah, up front, policy is not where I'm at. I'm an underground educator. And so I would say, um, in reality, the inside is pressured by the outside. And so any transformation that occurs in an institution like public education is almost never inspired from inside that institution. It comes from it happening elsewhere. And so I think that one of the answer I would give to the question is creating alternative education spaces outside the institution, because you're not gonna be able to be as radical and as free and as dynamic as the vision may hold inside the institution. Because once you present the opportunity inside, it's gonna be chopped down and watered down. You gotta get out the kitchen and go somebody else's kitchen and make it how you want to make it. And so there's a number of examples. And I'll say Wall Block Freedom Schools, that was a space that I was a part of from the beginning, that we were able to create alternative space within the school. And that influenced the school to a point so much that the schools tried to make their own freedom schools. Shame on them. But, but they tried to make their own freedom schools. It inspired them. Teachers that were a part of freedom schools saw how we did things in freedom schools, and they implemented circle practice into their classroom. The books that we were reading in freedom schools by Black and brown authors, teachers then started to see that, and they started to add those books to their curriculum. How'd it go? That's what's up. I love that. All right, then, y'all. Young people amongst us. Creative justice. They create beautiful educational spaces that are not in the class, that are not in the classroom, they're not in the school, but they're spaces where education occurs, where conversations occur, where dialogues occur. And this is the thing, is schools should be places where it's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to experiment and try to find something new. And that's exactly what creating a decolonized educational space, you're gonna have to create a space that you're gonna mess up. There's gonna be some things that don't meet the mark. But the problem with trying to implement them first inside the institution is what? Metrics. Everything you wanna do, they need a number, they need an explanation, and they need a dollar amount next to it. And if you don't meet the outcome, then it's the program that's criticized and not the issue that made the program necessary. And so this is what people are experiencing with TERP, Trauma Informed Restorative Practices grant from King County, Best Start for Kids. A lot of the outcomes that the organization set, they weren't able to meet. And that's not because the organizations are whack. It's because racism is a huge issue and it takes more than 3 years to undo it. And you can't blame the programming. And so these things have to happen outside of the institution, because then players, like Nikita mentioned, that are inside the institutions will start to hopefully apply with some fidelity those dynamics, those things. So like at Rainier Beach, we started to implement and practice circle in our spaces, in wall block spaces, reuse circle practice. That had such an impact on the young people and the teachers that were involved that teachers started to advocate that all teachers within the school utilize circle practice, to a point now at the beginning of every quarter and every semester, all teachers hold community building circles in their classrooms. That happened outside of the institution, and then they were able to apply it step by step. And so I would just say, it's similar to being an abolitionist versus having abolitionist values. You got to do it in a space that you can go all the way, be radical as possible, no limit. Because if you try to implement these things at first inside the institution, it's not going to go very far. It's going to be more criticism than support. And then you'll be convinced that it doesn't work, which just isn't true. And decolonizing education is going to be just as arduous of a process as it was to colonize us. It's going to be just as hard. Go ahead, Kale.
I'll just say it actually might be harder. And, a reminder to us, Freedom Schools actually evolved out of protest. It was educational spaces were not serving Black children. It was during segregation. And as things were being brought into integration, you could continue to see that schools, even if we were in the same schools, things were not equal. So then people would walk out on schools, but they didn't want to walk out on being educated. So they would create their own school spaces. Here in Seattle, there was a 3-day freedom school. People boycotted Seattle public schools, but then created freedom schools in churches and in other spaces where they could teach that radical curriculum. So even the history of creating decolonized spaces, at least here locally, on the land that we're on, here in the coastal Salish territories, was out of protest. So we really should take seriously more our what power comes out of protesting the current educational system and using that as a tool to create those spaces Jarrell was just talking about, because that history has taught us that it does force change.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our time. I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists, Jarrell and Nikita. Thank you so much for participating in this call with us. I think this has been such an amazing conversation. And I know that if we had the time, we could go on all day about this. And I also want to thank everyone in attendance. Thank you so much. Our next Lunch and Learn in this series, I believe is on, and correct me if I'm wrong, Vilma, I believe is on decolonizing the classroom as a whole. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate it. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jarrell and Nikita. It was really great. Good stuff for thought. And next one, we're going to have John Greenberg and the Washington Youth Council to talk about decolonizing the classroom. So everyone come back. Bring your friends.
Thank y'all for the opportunity. Great job, Nikita.
Great job, Jarrell. Thanks for having us, Auntie Velma. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. And thank you, Renika, for such a great job.
Yeah, thank you, Renika.
Thank you.
Facilitator.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mhm. All
All
right, then
right,
y'all go
y'all.
eat some lunch.
Yes,
Yep.
please.
Bye.
Bye.